Nigeria's National Bureau of Statistics has attributed the slow growth of Nigeria's economy in 2022 to the performance of the agriculture sector, which recorded incidences of flooding across the country. Now, how can this be addressed going forward? Kola Masha, CEO of Babban, Gona, joins me for this discussion. Kola, thank you so much. Great to see you on the show today. I'd like us to start.
So good to see.
I'd like us to start with your reading of this latest GDP report. I was seeing the agricultural sector dragging the overall figure down.
Yes, no, I think we've typically what you see is Q4 tends to be the strongest quarter for agriculture, and what we've seen is actually performance in Q4 is the lowest it has been in more than 7 years. So it is particularly challenging. And I think it's fundamentally attributed to multiple factors, but flooding paramount of which, where we've seen the worst flooding in a decade. I think last time we saw flooding like we did in 2022 was that way back in 2012, where we had a significant challenge as well. And I think, unfortunately, that was the flooding was also exacerbated by acts of some of our neighbors, like Cameroon, who really opened up some of their dams to mitigate challenges that they faced, but in turn, really exacerbated the flooding conditions in the north, central, southeast, and south parts of the country.
Now, what kind of efforts need to go into recovery? Because obviously we need to recover and we need to, leapfrog if we can. But what does that look like on the ground?
Well, I think, if we go back to some of the challenges that we faced these challenges in the past, and the way that the government has tried to compensate for this was really helping to stimulate growth in the dry season agriculture. Particularly, this is important in the rice value chain. I think of all the crops, rice, hands down, is the crop that was most affected due to flooding, particularly because it's grown predominantly in the lowlands, and also grown predominantly in those regions in the southeast, south, and north central that were most impacted. Now, what the government did in 2012 and 2013 was to really develop programs to stimulate production in the dry season to compensate for the volumes that were lost. That's the most immediate thing that needs to happen. I think the second piece is really around trying to ensure that the government actively going into the 2023 season takes the adequate steps to ensure farmers have access to the capital they need to buy the quantity and quality of inputs that are critical.
No, that was good.
I should probably also
go ahead.
I should also note that last year agriculture was actually hit by 2 key factors. The first was that hit the sector early in about March, April, was dramatic growth in cost of inputs. Fertilizer, which typically makes up about 50% of the cost of goods of most farmers, went up 3-fold year over year. Driven by both the Ukraine crisis as well as other challenges with access to natural gas globally. So that coupled with, so farmers were already handicapped last year, and then we were hit again with the flooding.
Now, I was going to ask you about your outlook for the sector this year. I know you've talked about what the government needs to do, but as you know, we will be having a new government coming on board. Are you anticipating a policy shift, or perhaps imagining a situation where the new government continues to build on what's already been established, perhaps maybe from a policy perspective or initiatives, etc.?
Well, I do hope that there isn't tremendous. I think to a certain degree, I think the numbers do kind of speak for themselves to a certain degree. I think if you look at the GDP growth rate of agriculture over the last 7 years, the trend line is actually, unfortunately, consistently downwards. So I do think there needs to be a reinvigoration of the sector with a particular focus on ensuring that there is increased capital flows, particularly in debt, flowing to the sector. There potentially, what we don't want to see, though, is going back to some of the policies that we saw, more than a decade ago, where government intervened, particularly in the input supply chains, started buying fertilizer and distributing fertilizer themselves. I think what you find with those, particularly state governments doing that, what you found was that it didn't really encourage the private sector and really kind of created a lack of investment in the input supply chains.
Now let's quickly talk about agri exports. Now, Nigeria's capacity to earn foreign exchange continues to dwindle despite the growth and increasing contribution of the non-oil sector. Statistics from MBS last year showed that in the third quarter, there was a 40.6% decline in agricultural exports compared to what we saw in Q2 of 2022. What do we need to do? What are the challenges? I know we've talked about this before, but I mean, perhaps with a new year, new government, that could provide some fresh perspective, on things as they are. But what do we need to do to boost agricultural exports?
Well, I think there's a couple different aspects that need to happen. I think, unfortunately, today, most of our agricultural exports are commodities that really don't grow in many other places, right? Take, for example, cocoa really only grows in a very, very small geographic area around the world, very close to the equator. So by default, we typically are major players in that, but in reality, we have become a distant fourth or fifth in the world when we used to be second in the world. I think the other key piece that the government needs to focus on is in many parts of the world, there is an increased desire for organic and non-GMO products, which I think Nigeria has a unique opportunity to basically play a key role to service many of those markets. What tends to happen is when you're producing non-GMO or organic products, oftentimes, labor costs are more, so on and so forth, which we have a comparative advantage for. You started to see some growth in the soybean sector, as an example, where Nigeria is exporting a lot of non-GMO soybean products that end up making farmers quite a bit of money. But I think targeting some of those areas for high growth, I think, would be critical.
All right. Finally, if there's one aspect on the value chain that you strongly believe that the government policymakers should focus on or give urgent attention to in 2023, what would it be? If they're going to see the biggest return on investment, it's going to be unlocking capital to farmers. Right. The reality is agriculture is 30% of GDP. Consistently, agriculture gets less than 3% of bank debt, creating opportunities where they can unlock debt, both from the banks as well as from the capital markets into agriculture, particularly to farmers. That's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck.